call came on a Tuesday, November 1999. I was at work when my pager went off. The number was my mother's and there was a 911 after it. I knew before I called back. You always know. Dad was gone, 83 years old. He'd been sick for a while, his body finally giving out after decades of carrying something it was never meant to carry. When I hung up the phone, I sat there in my office for a long time, staring at nothing. My secretary knocked eventually, asked if I was okay. I told her I needed to leave. Family emergency. But I didn't leave right away. I sat there and I thought about May 20th, 1967. I thought about a 9-year-old boy being sent to meet his father at a bus terminal. I thought about a smell I can still recall perfectly, 32 years later. Sulfur and burnt motor oil and something else. Something wrong. I thought about burns that never faded, a story that never changed. My father, Stefan Michalak, died believing he'd encountered something in the woods near Falcon Lake that defied explanation. He died with scars on his chest shaped like a grid. He died having told the same story, in the same way for 32 years. He never wavered, not once. And I was there for all of it, not in the woods, not on that day. But I was there for everything that came after. I was there when he came home sick and burned and smelling like something from another world. I was there when the RCMP came, when the Air Force came, when the reporters came. I was there when our lives got turned inside out, when my father became the UFO guy, when our family became that family. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm not here to say what did or didn't happen in those woods. I'm here to tell you what it was like to be the son of Stefan Michalak. What it was like to live with the aftermath of May 20th, 1967. What it was like to watch your father carry something nobody could explain. Something that marked him physically and followed him until his last breath. My name is Stan Michalak, and this is my father's story, but it's also mine. Let me take you back, not to 1999, but earlier, back to before, back to when we were just a normal family in Winnipeg and my father was just a man who loved rocks. My father was born in Poland in 1916. He didn't talk much about the old country, but what he did say painted a picture of a different man, a different life. Before Canada, before Winnipeg, before Falcon Lake, there was war. He served in the military police specifically. When the Germans came, he saw things. He survived things. Concentration camps, liberation, the kind of things that mark a man in ways that never show on the surface but change the architecture of who they are forever. When he came to Canada in the late 1940s, he brought my mother, Maria, and they built a life. He worked as an industrial mechanic, good with his hands, good with machines, the kind of guy who could look at something broken and see how to fix it. He worked at the Royal Canadian Mint in Winnipeg for years. Steady work, honest work, but his passion, his real passion, was geology. We called him the Rock Nut, not in a mean way. It was said with affection, because Dad loved rocks the way some men love cars or hockey. He'd spend hours in the basement hunched over his workbench, examining specimens under that magnifying glass. He'd chip away at stones with his little hammers, looking for the glint of something valuable. Quartz, silver, sometimes just interesting minerals that caught the light in peculiar ways. On weekends, he'd pack up his gear and disappear into the wilderness. Manitoba has a lot of wilderness. The Whiteshell region, east of Winnipeg, was his favourite. Precambrian shield country, some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth, billions of years old. He told me that once, trying to explain why he found it so fascinating. The rock remembers everything, he said in his accented English, holding up a piece of pink granite. Everything that ever happened is written in here. You just have to know how to read it. I was maybe 7 or 8 when he said that. I didn't really understand it then, but I understood that my father found something in those rocks that he didn't find anywhere else. Peace, maybe. Purpose. A connection to something ancient and unchanging. He'd been prospecting near Falcon Lake for a couple of years by 1967. He'd even staked some claims in 1966, areas where he thought the quartz veins might be associated with silver deposits. Other prospectors had found silver in the region. Dad thought he could too. Every Victoria Day long weekend he'd make the trip. About 90 miles east of Winnipeg, right on the edge of the White Shell Provincial Park. Beautiful country. Dense pine forests, crystal clear lakes, the kind of silence you can only find far from civilization. He'd stay at the Falcon Motor Hotel, this little place right on the highway. Nothing fancy, just a motel with a coffee shop, a place to rest between days of hiking through the bush with his hammer and his maps and his unshakable belief that the next rock he turned over might be the one. My mother would pack him food. She'd check his gear, make sure he had everything. My sister Eva, my brother Mark and I, we'd see him off. "Be careful out there," Mum would say. "Always am," he'd reply. And he was. Careful, I mean. Dad wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He'd plot his routes, mark his maps, leave word about where he was going. He understood the woods could be dangerous if you didn't respect them. Time twos. In May of 1967, he made his plans like always. Victoria Day, long weekend, Friday through Monday, 4 days to prospect, to chip away at the Precambrian shield, to search for whatever he was searching for out there in the quiet. I remember the Thursday before he left. He was in the basement, organising his gear. I came down to watch him work. He was rolling his maps, securing them with rubber bands. His rock hammer was clean, the pick end sharp. He'd packed his canvas rucksack with food, sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, a thermos of coffee. "Going to find silver this time?" I asked him. He smiled at me. Maybe just more pretty rocks." "Can I come? When you're older, when you can keep up?" I was disappointed, but I understood. The bush was no place for a 9-year-old kid. Friday morning, May 19th, 1967, my father loaded his gear into his car. A practical car, nothing flashy. He kissed my mother goodbye. He ruffled my hair. He told us he'd see us Monday evening. And then he drove east toward Falcon Lake, toward the White Shell, toward whatever was waiting for him in those ancient woods. If I'd known what was coming, would I have said something different? Would I have asked him to stay? But you never know, do you? You never know which goodbye might be the last normal one. He checked into the Falcon Motor Hotel around 4:30 in the afternoon on Friday, May 19th. The desk clerk remembered him later, said he seemed perfectly normal, friendly, mentioned he was there to do some prospecting, same as always. He'd stayed there before. They knew him. Room 4, a simple room, bed, bathroom, a small desk, a black and white TV that probably got 3 channels if the weather was right. But Dad wouldn't have cared about the TV. He was there for the rocks, not the entertainment. That Friday evening he walked across the highway to the motel's coffee shop and had dinner. Meatloaf, probably. Mashed potatoes, the kind of simple, filling food that would stick with you for a long day of hiking. He had a beer, maybe 2. The RCMP would make note of that later, when they were trying to figure out what happened. trying to explain it away. After dinner, he went back to his room. He studied his maps under the single lamp. He'd marked spots he wanted to check out, quartz veins he'd identified on previous trips. The White Shell region was full of exposed Precambrian rock, granite and greenstone formations that had been there for billions of years. Somewhere in all that ancient stone, he believed, there was silver. He went to bed early. You had to if you wanted to get an early start. The best prospecting was done in the morning light, when the sun was low and caught the minerals at the right angle, made them shine. At home in Winnipeg, we were having our own Friday night. Mum made dinner, probably cabbage rolls, one of her specialties. Eva would have been helping in the kitchen. She was 14, old enough to be useful. Mark was 11, probably reading or working on a model airplane. I was 9, likely playing outside until Mum called me in. It was Victoria Day weekend, a long weekend. Monday was a holiday. For us kids, it meant no school. For Dad, it meant extra time in the bush. We weren't worried about him. We never were. This was what he did. This was normal. Saturday morning, May 20th, 1967, my father woke up at 5 a.m. He told investigators later what his routine was. He shaved, got dressed in his work clothes, durable pants, a shirt, a light jacket against the morning chill. He packed his rucksack, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, hard-boiled eggs, his thermos of coffee still hot, his rock hammer, his compass, his maps, a pencil and a small notebook for making notes and sketches. He put on his glasses. He'd wear his welding goggles later, if he needed them for close work in bright sunlight. The goggles were dark green, heavy glass, meant to protect your eyes when you're working with intense light or heat. He'd used them before when examining rocks in direct sun. By 5:30 a.m. he was walking out of the motel and into the woods. The Trans-Canada Highway cut through that region like a scar. On one side, civilization, on the other, wilderness. Dad crossed the highway and entered the trees. The trail wasn't much of a trail. You had to know where you were going. He'd been there enough times to know. The morning was beautiful. He'd say that later when he was trying to explain what happened. He'd say it was a perfect morning, not a cloud in the sky. Bright, sunny, warm for May. The kind of morning that made you glad to be alive, glad to be out in the woods with nothing but the sound of birds and the crunch of pine needles under your boots. He hiked for maybe an hour, working his way toward a spot he'd marked on his map, a quartz vein he'd found on a previous trip, running through an exposed section of the Precambrian shield. The rock there was pink granite, ancient and hard. The quartz vein cut through it like a white scar. Around noon he found his spot. He set down his rucksack. He took out his rock hammer. He knelt down on the warm granite and started examining the quartz vein, chipping away small samples, looking for any sign that it might be associated with silver ore. He worked for maybe 20 minutes. Methodical, patient. This was what he loved. This quiet, focused work, just him and the rocks and the billion-year-old stone remembering everything. And then the geese started. The sound the geese made wasn't normal. I need you to understand that. Dad knew geese. He'd spent enough time in the bush to know the difference between geese, just being geese, and geese reacting to something wrong. This was the latter. This was panic. They were taking off from a small lake maybe 40 yards from where he'd been working. Not taking off casually, the way geese do when they're just moving to a different spot. This was an explosion of wings and water and noise. This was escape. Dad's first thought was predator. Fox, maybe, or a fisher. Something had gotten too close to the water, spooked the birds. But when he looked up, he saw the geese were flying away from the lake, flying away from him, flying west. And they weren't looking down. They were looking up. That's when he saw the objects. He described them later as cigar-shaped, elongated. But they were changing as they descended. They were made of something that glowed, that pulsed with red-orange light. Not like fire, not like anything he'd seen before. Like they were made of light itself, or like they were so hot they were incandescent. They were moving together, descending in parallel, keeping perfect distance from each other. It was that coordination that struck him. They were moving like they were connected somehow, like they were parts of the same thing. Dad stood up, slowly. His rock hammer was still in his hand. He shielded his eyes against the sun, trying to get a better look at what he was seeing. The objects kept descending, getting closer, and as they dropped lower, one of them started to change shape. It went from that cigar shape to something more disc-like, wider in the middle, domed on top. The colour shifted too from that red-orange glow to something more metallic, more silver. One of the objects stopped its descent and hovered, just hung there in the air, maybe 100 feet up, perfectly still. The other one kept coming down. It was heading straight for the exposed granite outcrop about 50 yards from where Dad was standing. He watched it descend. Smooth, controlled, no sound of engines or rotors. Just this. Presence moving through the air like it belonged there, like gravity was optional. And then it landed. Just settled onto the flat rock like it was the most natural thing in the world. No impact, no noise. One moment it was descending, and the next it was resting on the ancient pink granite, solid and real. Dad stood there, frozen. His heart was hammering in his chest. He could feel his pulse in his throat, in his temples. Every instinct was screaming at him to run, to get away, to not be here. But he didn't run. The hovering object stayed where it was for maybe a minute, maybe less. Time felt strange to him later, when he tried to remember, like it was moving differently, like the normal flow of seconds had been interrupted. Then the hovering craft began to rise. It climbed smoothly, accelerating as it went, and within seconds it was gone. Just gone. Disappeared into the blue sky like it had never been there at all. But the other one stayed. The one that had landed stayed right there on the rock, about 160 feet away from him. Dad's hands were shaking. He reached into his rucksack, moving slowly, carefully, like he was afraid any sudden movement might make it leave, or worse, make it notice him. He pulled out his notebook, his pencil, and very carefully, trying to steady his hands, he started to sketch what he was seeing. Because whatever this was, whatever he was looking at, he knew he'd need to remember it. He knew that nobody would believe him unless he could show them, unless he could prove that he'd seen something real. The craft sat there on the granite, silent, still. It was roughly dome-shaped, maybe 30 to 35 feet in diameter. The surface appeared metallic, like polished stainless steel, smooth and seamless. There was no obvious propulsion system, no visible seams or rivets, nothing that looked like conventional aircraft construction. From where Dad sat, maybe 50 yards away, he could see what appeared to be openings or vents along the side. And there was light coming from inside. Not the red-orange glow from before, but something brighter, more purple. It spilled out of the openings and onto the rock, making strange shadows. He drew. The dome, the circumference, the openings, The way it sat on the rock, not quite touching, like there was a gap of air between the craft and the stone. Minutes passed, 5, 10, maybe more. The craft just sat there, waiting, or maybe not waiting, maybe just being. And then Dad made a decision. He stood up, slowly. His notebook was still in his hand. He took a step forward. Then another. He was going to get closer. He told himself it was American. That's what he thought as he walked toward it. Some kind of experimental aircraft, some secret military project. The Americans were always testing things in remote areas. Maybe they'd had some kind of malfunction, had to make an emergency landing. That's what he told himself. Because the alternative was too big, too impossible to consider. He walked slowly, carefully, watching for any sign of movement. His heart was still racing, but his mind was working through the problem logically, methodically. If it was American, if there were people inside, they might need help. He spoke some English. He could offer assistance. As he got closer, the heat became apparent. Not unbearable, not dangerous, but noticeable. Waves of warm air coming off the craft, washing over him in pulses. It smelled strange. Sulphur, definitely, like struck matches, but also something else, something electrical, like burnt insulation or ozone after a lightning strike. When he was maybe 20 feet away, he heard something. Voices, muffled, indistinct, but definitely voices, 2 of them, he thought. One higher pitched than the other, coming from inside the craft. They sounded human enough, though he couldn't make out any words. Dad stopped walking. He stood there, listening, trying to catch anything recognizable in the cadence or tone. And then he called out, "Okay, Yankee boys," he said in English. "Having trouble?" Silence. The voices stopped. For maybe 10 seconds there was nothing but the sound of wind in the pines and the faint hiss of whatever was powering the craft. Dad tried again, this time in Russian, then German, then Italian, French, Ukrainian, Polish. He cycled through every language he knew, offering help, asking if they needed assistance. Nothing. No response. The voices didn't resume, but the craft was still there, still silent, still waiting. Dad reached up and pulled his welding goggles down over his eyes. The light coming from that opening was bright. Too bright to look at directly without protection. The goggles cut the glare, made it possible to see details. He took another step forward. Then another. The opening was rectangular, maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The edges were clean, precise, like a door that had slid open rather than hinged. The purple-white light poured out, so bright it made the midday sun seem dim by comparison. Dad got close enough to look inside. What he saw he struggled to describe later. He tried. God knows he tried, through all the investigations, all the questioning, all the skeptical stares. But language failed him. How do you describe something that has no analogue, no reference point? He saw lights. Panels of lights, beams of light, lights flashing in patterns that seemed random, but probably weren't. Colours he couldn't name, arranged in grids and clusters. There were what appeared to be panels or screens covered in symbols or readouts, but nothing he could read, nothing that looked like any alphabet he'd ever seen. Beams of light crossed the interior space at odd angles, horizontal and diagonal, creating a maze of illumination. They seemed solid, like you could touch them, but Dad didn't try. And there was no one there, no pilots, no crew, no beings of any kind, human or otherwise. Just the lights, just the patterns, just this impossible interior that seemed larger than the exterior should have allowed. Dad stood there, peering through the opening, his welding goggles protecting his eyes from the glare. He was trying to make sense of what he was seeing, trying to find something familiar, some detail that would confirm his theory that this was man-made, that this was technology he could understand. But there was nothing familiar about it. And then, without warning, the opening began to close. 3 panels, metallic like the rest of the craft, slid across the opening from different directions. Smooth, silent, perfectly synchronized. Within seconds, the opening was sealed. The brilliant light was cut off. The surface was seamless again, like there had never been a door at all. Dad stepped back, his heart racing again. Whatever was happening, it was responding to him somehow. Either it knew he was there, or it was following some pre-programmed sequence. He wanted to understand. That's the thing about my father. He wasn't content with mystery. He needed to know. He needed to solve the puzzle. So he did something that, in retrospect, probably saved his life. He reached out and touched the craft. The surface was hot. Not just warm. Not just uncomfortable. Hot enough to melt. Dad pulled his hand back immediately, but the damage was done. The fingertips of his glove were already melting, the leather bubbling and blackening, wisps of smoke rising into the air. He could smell it, acrid and wrong, mixing with the sulphur smell that already surrounded the craft. He looked at his hand. The glove was ruined, the fingertips deformed, but his actual fingers underneath were okay. The leather had protected him, just barely. He stepped back further, putting distance between himself and the craft. His mind was racing. This wasn't American. This wasn't anything he recognized. This was something else entirely. And then the craft began to move, not lifting off, not yet. It was rotating, turning counterclockwise, smooth and controlled, pivoting on its center point like it was on a turntable. Dad watched, frozen. The rotation was slow at first, almost lazy, but it was deliberate, purposeful. As the craft turned, a different section of its hull came into view, and that's when Dad saw it. The grid, a panel, maybe 2 feet across, covered in a precise geometric pattern of holes. They were arranged in a grid, perfectly spaced, maybe half an inch in diameter each. There were dozens of them, possibly more than 100, all identical. The panel was rotating toward him, not facing him yet, but turning, degree by degree, bringing those holes into alignment with where he was standing. Something in Dad's gut told him to move, to get away, to run, but he was too slow. The craft completed its rotation, and the grid panel was facing him directly, maybe 10 feet away. And then it happened. A blast of hot air or gas or something shot out from those holes with tremendous force. It hit Dad square in the chest, a concentrated column of searing heat that felt like being too close to a blast furnace. The impact knocked him backward. He stumbled, his arms pinwheeling, trying to keep his balance. His shirt ignited instantly. Flames spread across his chest, his undershirt catching fire beneath the outer shirt. Pain. Immediate, overwhelming pain. Dad screamed. He tore at his clothes, ripping his burning shirt off, throwing it to the ground. His undershirt was still on fire. He yanked it, off too, the fabric sticking to his skin where it had already started to burn him. His cap had caught fire too. He pulled it off, threw it down, stomped on it with his boot until the flames were out. The blast had stopped as suddenly as it had started. The craft was silent again. Dad looked down at his chest. The skin was already angry red, blistering. He could see the pattern, the grid, burned into his flesh, a perfect reproduction of the holes on the craft's panel. And then the craft lifted off. It rose smoothly, straight up, as accelerating rapidly. Within seconds it was 100 feet up, then 200. Then it tilted slightly, rotated again and shot away toward the west. Gone, just like the first one, disappeared into the clear blue sky. Dad stood there, shirtless, burned, his chest screaming with pain. Around him the forest was quiet again. The geese were gone. The craft was gone. It was just him, alone on the ancient granite, with burns shaped like a machine he couldn't explain. He noticed the smell then. Strong, overpowering, sulfur and burnt electrical insulation, but also something organic, something wrong. It clung to him, to his skin, to his hair, and he noticed something else. He was going to be sick. The nausea hit him in waves. At first, Dad thought it was just shock, adrenaline crash, the natural response to what had just happened. But it was more than that, deeper than that. He bent over and vomited onto the granite. Once, twice, his body heaving, trying to expel something that wasn't just in his stomach, but seemed to be in his blood, his bones, his cells. When the spasms stopped, he straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His chest was on fire. The burns were worse than he'd thought. He could see them clearly now, the perfect grid pattern, the skin already blistering in neat circles where each hole in the panel had directed its blast. He needed to get back. Back to the motel, back to civilization. He needed medical attention. Dad looked around, trying to orient himself. The sun was still high, but shadows were starting to lengthen. It must be 1, maybe 2 in the afternoon. He'd been at the site for maybe 2 hours, though time felt slippery, uncertain. He gathered what he could, his rucksack, his rock hammer, though it seemed absurd now, meaningless. He left the burned shirt and cap on the ground. Evidence, he thought. Though evidence of what? He wasn't sure. He started walking, west, back toward where the highway should be. His compass was in his pack, but he didn't take it out. He just walked, one foot in front of the other, trying to ignore the pain in his chest and the growing headache behind his eyes. The forest seemed different now. Darker, more oppressive. The trees crowded in, the underbrush caught at his legs. He stumbled over roots he should have seen, walked into, branches that should have been obvious. The nausea returned. He had to stop, brace himself against a birch tree and retch. Nothing came up this time, just dry heaves that left him gasping and weak. The headache was getting worse, not just a headache. A pounding, a pressure like his skull was too small for his brain. He'd had migraines before, but this was different. This felt wrong, like something was broken inside his head. He walked, stopped, vomited, walked again. Time lost meaning. He didn't know if he'd been walking for 20 minutes or 2 hours. The sun was lower, definitely lower, but he couldn't tell how much. The smell was still with him, that sulfur electrical something smell. It clung to his skin, his hair, seemed to be coming from inside him. He could taste it in the back of his throat, metallic and wrong. He began to worry he was lost. He'd been in these woods before, knew the area reasonably well, but nothing looked right. Or maybe his perception was off. Maybe the headache, the nausea, the burns were making it impossible to think clearly. He stopped again, leaned against a pine tree. His vision was swimming, the forest spinning slowly around him. He closed his eyes, tried to steady himself, to force his body to cooperate. He thought about his family, Maria, Eva, Mark, Stan. He had to get back. He had to tell them what happened. They'd never believe him, but he had to try. When he opened his eyes, he saw it, through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, a break in the forest. Open space. The highway. Dad pushed away from the tree and stumbled forward. His legs were shaky, his balance uncertain, but he kept moving. Toward the light. Toward the road. Toward help. He broke through the tree line onto the shoulder of the Trans-Canada Highway. The pavement was hot under the afternoon sun. A few cars passed, their drivers not noticing the shirtless, burned man emerging from the woods. Dad looked east, then west. He wasn't where he thought he'd be. He'd come out about a mile west of where he'd entered the woods that morning. The motel was east. He started walking. That's when he saw the RCMP car. Constable G.A. Solotki of the Falcon Beach Highway Patrol was driving his regular route when he saw the man, shirtless, walking unsteadily along the shoulder of the highway, carrying a rucksack. The constable would later write in his report that his first thought was drunk. Victoria Day weekend, lots of people camping, lots of beer, lots of poor decisions. He slowed his cruiser and pulled over. The man saw him and started waving, trying to flag him down. Dad walked towards the patrol car, relieved. Help. Finally. Someone who could get him to a hospital. Someone who could help make sense of what had just happened. Constable Solotki got out of his car. He was young, probably mid-20s, in his pressed uniform and campaign hat. He looked at Dad with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Sir, are you all right?" Dad stopped about 10 feet away. He held up his hand, palm out. "Don't come too close," he said. His English was accented but clear. "I might have radiation on me, or a disease, I don't know." The constable's expression shifted. This wasn't a drunk. This was something else. Something weird. "Sir, what happened to you?" Dad started to explain. He told the officer he'd been prospecting. He told him about the geese, about the two objects descending, about the one that landed. He told him about getting burned. "Burned by what?" Constable Solotki asked. "A spaceship," Dad said. Then, realizing how that sounded, he clarified. "Or some kind of aircraft. Experimental, maybe. American, probably. I don't know. But it burned me." The constable looked at Dad's chest. Even from 10 feet away, the burns were visible. Red, blistered, arranged in that peculiar grid pattern. Not like any burn he'd seen before. But he didn't believe the story. That much was clear from his expression. He thought Dad was confused, or lying, or maybe having some kind of breakdown. "Sir, can you show me your burned clothing?" Dad gestured vaguely back toward the forest. "I left them. Back where it happened. I have my cap." He reached into his rucksack, pulled out the burned cap. The fabric was charred, a hole burned through the top. The constable examined it from a distance. He made notes in his pad. "Do you need medical attention, sir?" "Yes," Dad said. "I need a doctor. Can you drive me to the hospital?" Constable Solotki hesitated. Later, in his report, he'd write that he offered to drive Dad to Falcon Beach to arrange for someone to treat him. But Dad would remember it differently. He'd remember asking for help and being refused. The truth was probably somewhere in between. The constable was young, uncertain, dealing with a situation outside his training. A shirtless man with strange burns talking about spaceships. It didn't fit any category he knew. What's certain is that Dad didn't get a ride to the hospital. After a few more minutes of questions, during which Dad became increasingly frustrated and ill, the constable let him go. "You should see a doctor, sir." "That's what I'm trying to do," Dad replied. He turned and started walking east along the highway toward the Falcon Motor Hotel. The constable watched him go, then got back in his cruiser. He'd file his report later. Strange incident. Possible intoxication. Possible mental disturbance. Burns of unknown origin. Dad walked. The motel was maybe a mile away. His head was pounding. His chest screamed with every step, every breath. The nausea was constant now, a rolling sickness that never quite crested but never subsided either. The sun was getting lower. It must be 3, maybe 4 in the afternoon. He'd lost track of time. The whole day felt like it had happened to someone else, like he was watching it from outside his own body. When he finally saw the motel, the turquoise sign reading Falcon Motor Hotel, he felt a surge of relief so intense it almost knocked him down. He was going to make it. He was going to get inside, get to a phone, call Maria. He walked across the parking lot. A few people stared. A shirtless man with burns on his chest, stumbling like he'd been in a fight. But nobody approached him. Nobody asked if he needed help. He went to the motel office. The owner was there, a woman he'd spoken to when he'd checked in. She took one look at him and her eyes went wide. "I need a doctor," Dad said. "Is there a doctor in town?" She shook her head. "The nearest doctor is in Kenora, 45 miles east." Dad nodded. 45 miles. Too far. He needed to rest first. Needed to gather his strength. "Can I use your phone?" She pointed to the phone on the counter. Dad picked it up and dialed home. His hands were shaking. It rang twice before Maria picked up. "Maria," he said, "there's been an accident." Dad didn't tell Maria everything on the phone. He told her there'd been an accident. He told her he was burned, but okay. He told her he was coming home, that he'd catch the bus back to Winnipeg that evening. Could she have Stan meet him at the bus depot? He didn't tell her about the craft, about the grid, about the nausea and the headache and the smell that wouldn't leave him. That would wait. That needed to be said in person, face to face, where she could see that he wasn't crazy, that something real had happened. After the call, he went to his room, room 4. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he'd checked in, laid out his maps, planned his prospecting route. That was a different world, a world where rocks were the most interesting mystery. He couldn't look at himself in the bathroom mirror. The burns were worse now, the skin angry and blistered, the grid pattern impossibly precise. He tried to wash, but the water hurt, made the burns scream. He gave up after a few minutes. He needed a shirt. His were all burned or back in Winnipeg. He went to the motel's tiny gift shop and bought a t-shirt, the cheapest one they had with Falcon Lake printed across the chest. Tourist kitsch. It felt absurd, but he needed something to cover the burns. The bus left at 6 p.m. He had an hour. He lay down on the bed in room 4, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the last 6 hours. Had it really been only 6 hours? Since noon, when he'd been kneeling on the granite, chipping at the quartz vein? It felt like days. It felt like he'd lived an entire lifetime between then and now. The bus station was just a bench and a small shelter on the highway. Dad waited there with his rucksack, his rock, hammer still inside, his burned cap and gloves. Evidence. Though evidence of what, he still wasn't sure. When the Greyhound pulled up, he climbed aboard. The driver gave him a curious look but said nothing. The bus was mostly empty. Long weekend, most people were heading away from the city, not toward it. Dad found a seat in the middle and collapsed into it. The cushion was worn, the vinyl cracked, but it felt like the most comfortable thing he'd ever sat on. His body was exhausted, every muscle aching, the burns on his chest a constant fire. The bus pulled away from Falcon Lake, heading west toward Winnipeg. Dad pressed his forehead against the window and watched the forest slide past. Somewhere in there, maybe a mile north of the highway, was the place where it had happened. The granite outcrop, the landing site, the evidence. He should have brought the shirt, the burned shirt with the grid pattern. But he'd been in shock, not thinking clearly. He'd left it there on the rock along with his undershirt and cap. Wait, no. He had the cap. It was in his rucksack. And the glove, the one with the melted fingertips. Those were real. Those were proof. But proof of what? The question circled in his mind as the bus rumbled west. What had he seen? What had happened to him? He told the RCMP officer it was a spaceship, then immediately backpedaled, said it was probably American, probably experimental. Because spaceships sounded crazy. Because you don't tell authority figures you've seen spacecraft and expect to be taken seriously. But what else could it have been? The way it moved, silent and smooth. The way it landed with no visible means of propulsion. The interior, that maze of lights, those symbols he couldn't read. The heat that could melt leather. The blast that had burned that perfect grid into his chest. Nothing he knew. Nothing in his experience as a mechanic, as a military man, as someone who understood machines could account for what he'd seen. The other passengers on the bus avoided looking at him. He must have looked terrible, pale, sweating, hunched over in pain, and the smell. He could still smell it on himself, that sulfur electrical stink. Other people could probably smell it too. The nausea came in waves. He'd stopped vomiting. There was nothing left to bring up, but the feeling remained. That deep, cellular sickness, like every atom of his body, was wrong. The headache was constant now, a pressure behind his eyes, a pounding in his temples. His vision would blur occasionally, the bus interior swimming in and out of focus. He closed his eyes and tried to rest. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. The craft. The purple light spilling from the opening. The grid rotating toward him. The blast. The bus ride took almost 2 hours. The sun set somewhere along the way, the sky turning orange, then purple, then black. Dad watched it happen through the window, barely registering the transition from day to night. When they finally pulled into the Winnipeg bus depot, it was dark. The terminal lights were bright, harsh, making Dad's headache worse. He stood up carefully, his body protesting every movement, and made his way to the front of the bus. The driver gave him a concerned look. "You okay, sir?" "I will be," Dad said, though he wasn't sure that was true. He stepped off the bus into the terminal. People were everywhere, arriving, departing, buying tickets, saying goodbyes. Normal people doing normal things. Dad felt like an alien among them, like he'd crossed some invisible line and could never come back. And then he saw me, 9 years old, waiting with my mother near the entrance. I saw him and started to run forward, but Mum put her hand on my shoulder, held me back. Because even from a distance, even to a 9-year-old kid, it was obvious something was very, very wrong. The first thing I remember is the smell, not seeing Dad's face, not the burns, though I'd see those soon enough. The smell. It hit me when he got close, walking across the bus terminal toward where Mom and I were waiting. This overwhelming, nauseating odor that made me take a step back without meaning to. Sulfur. Like someone had been striking matches, hundreds of matches, thousands. But also something else. Burnt motor oil, electrical fire, ozone, and underneath it all, something organic and wrong, something that made my 9-year-old brain think of sickness, of disease, of death. It was coming from him, from Dad. It surrounded him like an aura, visible almost, a distortion in the air. "Stefan," Mum said quietly when he reached us. She didn't hug him. She wanted to, I could tell, but something held her back. The smell, maybe, or the look on his face. He looked terrible, pale, sweating, his eyes unfocused. The t-shirt he was wearing didn't fit right, too small, stretched tight across his chest. I could see something underneath it, something dark, something wrong with the way it sat on his skin. "Let's go home," he said. The drive back was quiet. Dad sat in the front passenger seat, Mum driving, me in the back. Nobody spoke. The smell filled the car, inescapable. I rolled down my window a crack, trying to get fresh air, but it didn't help much. When we got home, Ava and Mark were waiting. Ava was 14, old enough to understand something serious had happened. Mark was 11, trying to act tough but clearly scared. Dad went straight to the bedroom, Mum followed him. They closed the door. Ava, Mark and I sat in the kitchen. We could hear voices through the wall, too low to make out words. Mum's voice, questioning. Dad's voice, explaining. Neither of them sounding like themselves. After maybe 20 minutes, Mum came out. Her face was pale. She looked at us like she was trying to figure out what to say. "Your father had an accident," she said finally. "He's going to be okay, but he needs to rest. Stan, he wants to see you for a minute." Me? Why me? I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door was open a crack. The smell was stronger here, concentrated. I had to breathe through my mouth. I pushed the door open. Dad was sitting on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped. He'd taken off the t-shirt, his chest was bare, and I saw them. The burns. They covered his upper chest and stomach. Not random burns, not the kind you'd get from touching something hot or getting too close to a fire. These were organized, precise. A grid pattern of circular burns, each one about the size of a quarter, arranged in perfect rows and columns. The skin around each burn was angry red, already blistering. The burns themselves looked deeper, more serious, like something had focused intense heat on those exact spots and nowhere else. "Stan," Dad said. His voice was hoarse. "Come here." I walked closer, trying not to stare at the burns, trying not to show how scared I was. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something happened today, something I don't understand, but I need you to know I'm okay. I'm going to be okay." He was telling me, but he was also telling himself, trying to make it true by saying it out loud. "What happened to you, Dad?" He looked at me for a long moment, then he shook his head. "I'll tell you when you're older, when you can understand." But I understood enough. I understood that whatever had happened in those woods had hurt him, had marked him, and that the smell, that horrible, overwhelming smell, was somehow part of it. "Go on," he said. "Let me rest." I left the room. Mum was waiting in the hallway. She hugged me, which she didn't usually do, not without a reason. That night, Dad didn't sleep. I could hear him through the wall, coughing, moving around. Once I heard him get up and go to the bathroom, I heard him vomiting. And the smell was everywhere. In the hallway, in the living room, seeping under doors through vents, that sulfur electrical death smell that clung to him like a curse. It would be there for weeks, long after the acute phase of the burns, long after the vomiting stopped, long after he could get out of bed without help. The smell persisted, like it was coming from inside him, like something had gotten into his cells and wouldn't leave. I didn't know it then, but that smell would haunt me for the rest of my life. I can still recall it perfectly, 32 years later. I can close my eyes and I'm 9 years old again, standing in that hallway, smelling something that didn't belong in our world. That was the night our lives changed. The night we stopped being a normal family in Winnipeg and became something else, the UFO family. Sunday morning, Mum drove Dad to the Misericordia Hospital. He'd spent the night vomiting, sweating, his body racked with chills one moment and burning up the next. The burns on his chest had gotten worse, the blistering more severe. And the smell. God, the smell was everywhere. I stayed home with Eva and Mark. We sat in the kitchen, not talking much, just waiting. The house still smelled like sulfur. I'd opened all the windows, but it didn't help. At the hospital, they took Dad seriously. The burns were impossible to dismiss. The emergency room doctor examined him, photographed the injuries, took detailed notes. The pattern was too precise to be accidental, too uniform. Circular burns arranged in a perfect grid, each one the same size, the same depth, the same spacing. How did this happen? The doctor asked. Dad told him. Not about spaceships this time. He'd learned his lesson with the RCMP officer. He told the doctor he'd encountered some kind of aircraft, experimental possibly, and it had expelled hot gas or steam that burned him. The doctor didn't question it too deeply. He was focused on the medical aspect, on treating the injuries, of first-degree burns primarily. Some areas showing signs of deeper tissue damage, definitely consistent with intense, focused heat. But there was something else. Something the doctor couldn't quite categorize. Dad's white blood cell count was abnormal. His lymphocytes were depressed. He was showing symptoms consistent with something. Radiation exposure, possibly. But the tests for radiation came back inconclusive. They treated the burns with ointment and bandages. They gave him pain medication. They took more blood samples for additional testing, and they told him to come back if the symptoms worsened. What do you think it was? Mum asked the doctor quietly. The doctor shook his head. I don't know. Burns like this. I've never seen burns like this. Too precise, too organized. It's like something stamped them onto his skin. They came home that afternoon. Dad looked worse than when he'd left. The bandages made his chest look bulky, alien. He moved like an old man, careful, pained. He went straight to bed. We were told not to bother him. He needed rest. He needed time to heal, but he didn't heal. Not quickly, not easily. Monday was Victoria Day, the holiday he'd planned to spend prospecting. Instead, he spent it in bed, too sick to move. The vomiting continued, the headaches, the weakness. He couldn't keep food down, couldn't focus his eyes properly. His body was fighting something, but nobody could say what. And the smell persisted, that horrible, pervasive smell that clung to him, to his clothes, to the sheets, to everything he touched. Tuesday, May 23rd, Dad made a decision. He was going to tell his story. Publicly, he was going to contact the newspapers. Mum tried to talk him out of it. Stefan, people will think you're crazy. "I'm not crazy," he said. "Something happened to me. Something real, and if it can happen to me, it can happen to someone else. They need to know. They need to be warned." That's what he told her, and I think he believed it. But there was something else too. He needed people to know. He needed validation. He needed someone to believe him, to take him seriously, to help him understand what had happened. That afternoon, a civilian UFO investigator named J.B. Thompson came to the house. He'd heard about the incident somehow, through channels Dad didn't fully understand. Thompson was professional, polite, equipped with cameras and notepads. He photographed Dad's burns, close-up shots that showed the pattern in stark detail, the circular lesions, the precise spacing, the grid that looked like it had been stamped onto his flesh by something manufactured, something precise. Those photographs would become famous. They'd be published in newspapers, shown on TV, reproduced in books and documentaries for decades. But on that Tuesday afternoon, they were just documentation, just evidence of something nobody could explain. Thompson interviewed Dad for hours. He took detailed notes. He asked about every aspect of the encounter. What time did it happen? What were the weather conditions? What exactly did the craft look like? What sounds did it make? What did you feel? Dad answered everything as clearly as he could. He showed Thompson his notebook with the sketches he'd made at the scene. The dome, the proportions, the openings. Rough drawings, but detailed enough to give a sense of what he'd seen. Thompson didn't judge. He didn't call Dad crazy. He just listened, documented, treated the whole thing like it was a serious investigation. Which, to him, it was. When the interview was over, Thompson shook Dad's hand. "I believe you," he said. "I don't know what you saw, but I believe something happened to you." That meant something to Dad, more than he probably let on. Someone believed him. Someone took him seriously. The next day, Wednesday, May 24th, the story hit the newspapers. Winnipeg man claims UFO burned him. And just like that, our lives changed forever. They came in waves. First, the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, 2 officers in uniform, serious men with notepads and questions. They interviewed Dad for hours. They wanted to know everything, every detail. They wrote it all down. Then the Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, sent investigators. They brought maps, technical equipment, recording devices. They set up our dining room like a command center. Papers everywhere. Photographs spread across the table. Dad's sketches studied under magnifying glasses. They were trying to figure out what had happened. Or maybe they were trying to figure out if Dad was lying. I was kept out of most of it. 9 years old, I wasn't allowed in the dining room when the investigators were there. But I could hear them. Through the wall, their voices formal and official. Dad's voice, patient but strained, telling the story over and over. "What time did you first observe the objects?" "Approximately noon." "Can you describe the trajectory of their descent?" "From the west, descending at an angle, moving together until one landed." "Did you observe any markings or insignia on the craft?" "No, the surface was smooth, no visible markings." Questions and answers, hours of it, days of it. They asked about his mental state. Had he been drinking? Yes, he'd had beer the night before, but he wasn't drunk. Had he taken any medications? No. Any history of mental illness? No. Any reason to fabricate this story? No. They were polite about it. Professional. But the implication was clear. They were looking for an explanation that didn't involve a craft from God knows where landing in the Manitoba wilderness. The Department of National Defense got involved, the Department of Health, American agencies too. The US Air Force's Project Blue Book sent investigators. The University of Colorado's UFO study, the Condon Committee, sent a researcher named Roy Craig. Our house became a parade of officials. Men in suits, men in uniforms, men with briefcases and cameras and skeptical expressions. And the neighbours noticed. We lived in a normal suburban neighbourhood. Quiet street, modest houses, people who went to work and mowed their lawns and minded their own business. But when RCMP cars and military vehicles start parking in front of your house, people notice. When men in uniform come and go at all hours, people talk. The kids at school found out. By the end of that first week, everyone knew my dad was the UFO guy. Some of them thought it was cool. Your dad saw a spaceship, that's awesome. Some of them thought it was crazy. I heard the whispers. His dad's nuts. Making it all up. Probably drunk. I didn't know what to think. I was 9. I believed my dad because he was my dad. But I also understood that what he was saying was impossible. Spaceships weren't real. Aliens weren't real. Were they? At home, Dad was getting sicker. Not better. Sicker. The burns weren't healing properly. The blistering was worse. He'd lost weight, maybe 15 pounds in the first week. He couldn't keep food down. The vomiting continued. The headaches were constant. And he was exhausted. All the time. He'd sit in his chair in the living room and just stare at nothing, his eyes hollow. Mum would try to get him to eat something and he'd take a few bites and then give up. The smell was still there. Fainter now, not as overwhelming as those first few days, but still present. Still wrong, like it had soaked into his skin, into his cells, and wouldn't leave. The investigators asked if they could examine his clothing, the burned cap and glove he'd kept. Dad agreed. They took the items to a lab for analysis. They tested for radioactivity. The cap came back negative. No radiation. The glove showed trace amounts, but nothing conclusive. Nothing that proved or disproved anything. In early June, Dad did something that, looking back, probably complicated everything. He went back to Falcon Lake. He'd promised the RCMP he wouldn't go back, that he wouldn't disturb the site. They wanted to examine it themselves, wanted to preserve whatever evidence might be there. But Dad couldn't stay away. Late June, about 5 weeks after the incident, he drove back to Falcon Lake with a friend, a man named Gerald Hart. They hiked into the woods. Dad led the way, following his memory, trying to retrace his steps from that morning in May. It took them hours to find it. The bush all looks the same if you don't know what you're looking for. But eventually they found the outcrop, the flat expanse of pink granite, the Kettle Lake nearby, and the landing site. It was unmistakable. A circle, maybe 15 feet in diameter, where the moss and lichen had been burned away completely. Just bare rock, swept clean, like something had hovered there and radiated intense heat. Around the circle, the vegetation showed damage. Pine needles that should have been green were brown, dead. Small plants were shriveled. Even the lichen on the surrounding rock looked scorched. Dad stood at the edge of the circle, just stood there, staring at it. Hart said later that Dad looked like he was seeing a ghost, or maybe confronting a memory he wasn't sure was real until that moment. It was here, Dad said quietly. This is where it landed. They searched the area. Dad found the things he'd discarded during his escape. An old saw he'd been carrying, dropped and forgotten, a shopping bag, and most importantly, his shirt, The burned shirt, the outer shirt he'd torn off when it caught fire. It was lying there on the rock, right where he'd thrown it, weathered by 5 weeks of exposure, but still intact. He picked it up. The burn pattern was clearly visible on the fabric. The grid, the precise circular holes burned through the material, matching exactly the pattern on his chest. Hart photographed everything: the circle of bare rock, the dead vegetation, the shirt, Dad standing at the site pointing out where the craft had been, where he'd been standing when the blast hit him. Then Dad did something that would later cause problems. He collected samples. He'd promised not to disturb the site. But he was a geologist at heart, and he needed evidence. He took soil samples from inside the circle. He used his rock hammer to chip pieces of rock from the surface. He collected everything in plastic bags and put them in his rucksack. When they got back to civilization, Dad contacted the authorities. He told them he'd found the site. He had evidence, physical evidence. The RCMP was not happy. He'd contaminated the scene. He'd removed materials. How could they know what he'd found was authentic? How could they trust that he hadn't planted evidence? But Dad insisted, test the samples, test the soil, you'll see. They did. They took the soil samples he'd collected and sent them to a laboratory for analysis. The results came back. Highly radioactive. The soil sample Dad had collected from the landing site showed radiation levels high enough to be potentially dangerous, not catastrophic, not immediately life-threatening, but elevated, significantly elevated. Suddenly, the authorities took things much more seriously. They swept Dad's house for radioactive materials. They confiscated the remaining soil samples. They wanted to know exactly what he'd been exposed to, and they wanted Dad to lead them to the site, immediately. An official investigation team, RCMP and Air Force personnel. They needed to examine the location themselves. On July 3rd, 1967, Dad led a team of investigators back into the White Shell. There were 7 of them: military personnel, police, technical experts with Geiger counters and soil analysis equipment. They brought cameras. They brought measuring equipment. They brought everything they needed to document and analyze the site. Dad led them straight to it. No hesitation. He knew exactly where it was. The circle was still there. The bare rock, the dead vegetation, everything exactly as he'd described it. The investigators documented everything. They photographed the site from every angle. They measured the diameter of the circle. They took temperature readings of the rock. They collected their own soil samples. And they brought out the Geiger counters. They swept the entire area. The circle, the surrounding rock, the vegetation. They found radiation. Not in the soil Dad had collected, interestingly, but in the cracks in the rock. Trace amounts, low level. Nothing dangerous to humans, but elevated above background levels. One of the investigators, a geologist, offered a theory. The Precambrian shield in this region contains natural deposits of radioactive minerals. Radium, thorium. Maybe what Dad had encountered was some kind of natural geological phenomenon. Gas escaping from a fissure in the rock. Superheated radioactive gas. Dad shook his head. No, I saw a craft. It was solid. It had mass. It moved with purpose. This wasn't gas from a rock. But the theory was recorded, put in the official report. A possible explanation. Natural phenomenon. Not a spacecraft. Just geology. The investigation continued through the summer. More tests, more interviews, more officials with more questions. But they couldn't explain it. Not fully. Not in a way that satisfied everyone. The official conclusion, when it finally came, was carefully worded. We cannot explain what Mr. Michalak encountered. The physical evidence is consistent with his account. However, we cannot confirm the presence of an unknown craft. The case remains unexplained. Unexplained. Not proven, but not disproven either. For Dad, it wasn't enough. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what had happened to him, and unexplained felt like being called a liar in the politest possible way. The media found us. Once the story broke, once the newspapers picked it up, it was like throwing chum in the water. Reporters smelled blood. They wanted the story. They wanted Dad. It started small. Local papers. The Winnipeg Tribune ran the story first, with Thompson's photographs of Dad's burns. The headline, Falcon Lake Man Burned by UFO. Then it spread. Regional papers picked it up. National news. CBC sent a camera crew. American papers got interested. Within a week, Dad's story was everywhere, and the reporters came to our house. They'd show up at all hours, morning, afternoon, evening, knocking on the door, ringing the bell. Mr. Michalak, can we ask you a few questions? Mr. Michalak, can we get a statement? Mr. Michalak, how does it feel to have encountered alien life? Dad tried to be patient. He'd talk to them at first, tell his story again, show them his sketches, describe what he'd seen, what had happened. But they didn't want just the facts. They wanted drama. They wanted speculation. They wanted him to say aliens. They wanted him to talk about little green men and flying saucers and invasions from Mars. And Dad wouldn't. He refused to sensationalize it. I don't know what it was, he'd say. I saw a craft. It could have been experimental. American, maybe, I don't know. But that wasn't exciting enough. So the papers wrote their own narratives. They added speculation. They made it about aliens, about otherworldly visitors, about things Dad had never claimed. The neighbours stopped being friendly, or rather, they stopped being normal. Some avoided us entirely, like craziness might be contagious. Others were too friendly, morbidly curious, asking intrusive questions at the grocery store or over the fence. So, Steve, you really think it was a spaceship? Did you see any aliens? My cousin says the government's covering it up. Is that true? Dad would try to explain, patiently, that he didn't know what it was. But people heard what they wanted to hear. At school, it got worse for us kids. Ava was in high school, old enough to understand the social implications. She'd come home in tears some days because of what the other kids said. The whispers, the jokes. Hey, Eva, phone home, Mark tried to fight back, literally. He got in a fight with a kid who called Dad crazy. Mum had to go to the school. It was humiliating for all of us. I was young enough that the kids in my grade didn't fully understand what was happening. But they knew it was weird. They knew my dad was in the papers. They knew something strange had happened. Some of them thought it was cool. Your dad's famous. Some of them kept their distance, like I might be weird too. Mum tried to shield us from it. She'd tell Dad to stop talking to reporters. Stefan, enough. We need our lives back. But Dad couldn't stop. He felt a responsibility. He'd said it from the beginning. If this could happen to him, it could happen to someone else. People needed to know. They needed to be warned. In November 1967, 6 months after the incident, Dad published a pamphlet. He wrote his own account, in detail, and had it printed. My Encounter with the UFO, it was called. 40 pages, published by a small Polish press in Winnipeg. Translated into English by a friend. It was his way of controlling the narrative. If the newspapers were going to distort his story, at least people could read his version. The truth, as he understood it. But it didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. Now, he wasn't just the guy who claimed to see a UFO. He was the guy who'd written a book about it. He was committed. He was all in. There was no going back to normal. Later, Dad would say he regretted going public. He'd tell interviewers years later that if he'd known what it would do to our family, to his reputation, to his life, he might have kept quiet. But I don't think that's true. I think he needed to tell the story. He needed someone, anyone, to understand what had happened to him. He needed validation. He needed to know he wasn't crazy. And he wasn't crazy. That's the thing. I lived with him. I watched him through all of it. He never wavered. He never changed his story. He never embellished or exaggerated. Something happened to him in those woods. Something real. Something that left physical marks. Whether it was alien or experimental or something else entirely, I don't know. But it was real. Dad didn't get better. That's what people don't understand when they hear the story. They hear about the encounter, the burns, the investigation. They don't hear about the months and years that followed, the ongoing sickness, the deterioration. Through the summer of 1967, he tried to work. He'd go to the mint, put in his hours, come home exhausted. But he couldn't maintain it. The headaches were too severe, the nausea too constant. He'd have to leave work early, call in sick, miss days at a time. He lost weight, a lot of weight. By fall, he'd lost maybe 30 pounds. His face became gaunt, his cheekbones sharp. His clothes hung on him. The burns healed, sort of. The blisters went away. The acute inflammation subsided. But the scars remained. The grid pattern, permanently marked on his chest. Circular scars, darker than the surrounding skin, arranged in those precise rows and columns. He'd never be able to take his shirt off in public without people staring, without questions, without remembering. And then, in January 1968, the burns came back. Dad woke up one morning and the pattern was back on his chest. Not blistered like before, but raised, red, angry-looking, the grid appearing like it was being stamped onto his skin from the inside. Mum called the doctor. They took photographs. The newspaper got wind of it and published pictures. UFO burns return to Falcon Lake Man. But here's where it gets complicated. The burns that came back in 1968 looked different from the original burns. The originals were irregular, unevenly spaced, like they'd been made by something organic, something chaotic. The 1968 burns were perfect, too perfect. A uniform grid, every circle the same size, same spacing, mathematically precise. Skeptics jumped on this. This was proof, they said, that Dad was faking it, that he'd somehow created these marks himself, that the whole thing was a hoax. The debate raged in newspapers, in UFO circles, in medical journals. Some people believed Dad was genuinely experiencing something, some kind of psychosomatic recurrence. Others believed he was deliberately creating the marks for attention. In August 1968, Mum and Dad drove to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. The Mayo Clinic was, and is, one of the best medical facilities in the world. If anyone could figure out what was wrong with Dad, it would be them. They ran tests, lots of tests. Blood work, x-rays, physical examinations. They documented everything, the original burn scars, the recurrent marks, his ongoing symptoms, and they sent him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatric evaluation was thorough. The doctor talked to Dad for hours. went through his history, his war experiences, his immigration to Canada, his work, his family, the incident at Falcon Lake. The psychiatrist's conclusion was interesting. He wrote in his report, "Despite the fact that his lesions have been diagnosed as obviously factitious, I can find no overt evidence of significant mental or emotional illness." Factitious. Medical term meaning artificially produced. In other words, self-inflicted. But the psychiatrist also said Dad wasn't mentally ill. He described Dad as pragmatic, down to earth. Someone who does not make up stories. So, which was it? Was Dad creating the marks himself, or was something else going on? I think the truth is more complicated than either explanation. I think the original burns, the ones from May 1967, were absolutely real. I saw them. The doctors documented them. They matched the pattern on his burned shirt. The recurrent burns in 1968, I don't know. Maybe they were psychosomatic. Maybe Dad's body was recreating the trauma. Maybe, on some level, he needed people to see the evidence, to believe him, and his body obliged. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something we don't have words for. What I do know is that the Mayo Clinic findings gave skeptics ammunition. For years after, people would point to that psychiatric report as proof that Dad was a faker, a hoaxer, someone desperate for attention. But they ignored the other part, the part where the psychiatrist said Dad wasn't mentally ill, the part where he said Dad was credible, pragmatic, not the type to fabricate stories. Dad came home from Mayo with more questions than answers. The medical establishment couldn't help him. They couldn't explain his ongoing symptoms. They couldn't cure him. And the sickness continued. For months. For years. He had good days and bad days. Days when he felt almost normal. Days when he could barely get out of bed. The headaches would come and go. The nausea would flare up. He'd have periods of weakness, of dizziness, of feeling like his body wasn't his own. Doctors couldn't find a cause. Blood work would come back normal. Scans showed nothing, but the symptoms persisted. It was like his body had been changed on some fundamental level, like whatever he'd been exposed to that day in May had rewired something deep inside him, and medical science had no framework for understanding it. By the early 1970s, the acute phase had passed. Dad wasn't violently sick anymore, but he was never quite well either. He'd aged in a way that went beyond years. He looked older than he should have. Tired, worn down. And he carried those scars, the grid pattern on his chest, for the rest of his life. A permanent reminder of May 20th, 1967. Life went on. That's what people don't understand. You have this extraordinary thing happen, this unexplainable event that turns your life inside out. And then, life continues. You still have to go to work, pay bills, raise your kids, mow the lawn. Dad went back to work at the Mint, eventually. When his health stabilized enough that he could put in full days. His co-workers knew about Falcon Lake, of course. How could they not? It had been in all the papers. Some of them believed him, some didn't. Most just didn't talk about it, which was probably the kindest thing they could do. At home, we developed a kind of routine around it. The story was always there, always part of our family history, but we didn't talk about it constantly. It became background. The thing that defined us to the outside world, but that we didn't need to discuss amongst ourselves, because we all knew. I grew up. 9 years old, became 10, became 13, became 16. I went through school carrying the knowledge that I was the UFO kid's son. Sometimes it was interesting. Sometimes it was embarrassing. Always it was there. Eva moved out, got married, started her own life. Mark did the same. I stayed home longer, being the youngest, watching Dad get older, watching the incident recede into the past, but never quite disappear. The UFO community never forgot about Dad. Over the years, researchers would contact him, people writing books, documentary filmmakers, UFO investigators. They all wanted to hear the story, to include Falcon Lake in their work. Dad would talk to them. He was always willing to talk about it. Not because he was seeking attention, but because he still believed people needed to know. Still believed that whatever he'd encountered might encounter someone else. But he never changed his story. Never. Not once. I must have heard him tell it 50 times over the years. To researchers, to journalists, to curious friends. And every time it was exactly the same. Same details, same sequence of events, same careful distinction between what he knew and what he didn't. I don't know what it was, he'd always say. I saw something. It was real. It burned me. But I never saw anyone inside it. I never claimed it was aliens. I don't know what it was. People would try to get him to speculate, to embellish, to add details that would make the story more dramatic. He never would. In the 1980s, the case got renewed attention. UFO researchers discovered that the Canadian government had done extensive investigations but hadn't released all the documentation. There were calls for transparency, freedom of information requests. The media picked it up again. Dad was interviewed again. The same questions, the same answers. He was older now. Greyer. The war and the years and the incident had all taken their toll, but his memory of that day was still sharp, still clear, still unchanged. I asked him once, I must have been in my 20s, why he kept talking about it, why he didn't just let it go. Move on. He looked at me for a long time before answering. Because it happened, he said. And if I don't tell the truth about it, people will tell their own version. They'll make it about aliens or government conspiracies or whatever they want. But I was there. I know what I saw. And I owe it to someone to tell it right. I think about that sometimes. The burden of being the sole witness to something extraordinary, of knowing something happened but not being able to prove it beyond doubt, of carrying that knowledge for your entire life, knowing most people think you're crazy or lying or deluded. Dad carried it. For 32 years, from 1967 until his death in 1999, he carried the story, the scars, the questions that never got answered, and he never wavered. In 1992, 25 years after Falcon Lake, Dad got a phone call. Unsolved Mysteries wanted to do a segment on his case. Unsolved Mysteries was a big deal in the early 90s. Robert Stack's voice. The spooky. Music. Real cases, reenactments, appeals for information. Everyone watched it. Dad agreed to be interviewed. By then, he was 76 years old, retired from the Mint, spending his days reading, working in his small garden, still occasionally prospecting for rocks. The crew came to Winnipeg. They set up lights in our living room, cameras, sound equipment. It was surreal seeing our modest home transformed into a television set. I was there for the interview, 34 years old by then, married with kids of my own. I sat off to the side watching Dad tell the story again. The same story, the same details. 25 years later, and nothing had changed. The interviewer was good, professional, respectful. They asked about the encounter, the burns, the aftermath, the investigations. And then, during a break in filming, something happened. They were adjusting the lights, getting water for Dad. The formal atmosphere relaxed a bit. Someone on the crew making small talk asked Dad, "Is this the craziest thing that's ever happened to you?" It was meant lightly, conversationally, a way to fill the silence. Dad's answer shocked everyone in the room. "No," he said quietly. The crew member laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Really? What could be crazier than a UFO encounter?" Dad looked at him, and then he started talking about the war. About Poland in the 1940s, about the German occupation, about what he'd seen as a military policeman, about the concentration camps, about liberation, about the things you see that change you forever, that make you understand what humans are capable of doing to each other. The room went silent, dead silent. The crew just listened. Nobody moved, nobody interrupted. Dad spoke for maybe 5 minutes, talking about things he rarely discussed, things he'd buried deep because they were too painful to carry in the light. When he finished, nobody said anything for a long moment. Then the director spoke up. His voice was quiet, respectful. "Mr. Michalak, we had no idea. Thank you for sharing that." The interview resumed. Professional, focused. But there was a different energy in the room now, a different understanding. This wasn't just some guy claiming to have seen a UFO. This was a man who'd lived through hell, who'd survived war, who'd seen humanity at its worst, who'd rebuilt a life in a new country, who'd worked hard, raised a family, minded his own business. And then, one day in May 1967, something happened to him. Something he didn't ask for. Something that marked him for the rest of his life. The Unsolved Mysteries segment aired a few months later. They did a good job. Respectful. Fair. They showed the photographs of the burns. They interviewed Dad. They talked to Chris Rutkowski, a Canadian UFO researcher who'd been studying the case. They didn't mock it. They didn't try to debunk it. They presented it as what it was, an unsolved mystery. Dad got letters after that, hundreds of them. People from all over North America who'd seen the episode, some sharing their own stories, some offering theories, some just saying they believed him. That meant something to him. At 76, after 25 years of being the UFO guy, of being doubted and mocked and questioned, having people say, "I believe you," mattered. But it didn't change anything. He still didn't know what he'd encountered, still didn't have answers, still carried the scars, still remembered that day in May with perfect clarity. After the filming, after the crew packed up and left, I sat with Dad in the living room. Just the two of us. The lights were off. We sat in the gathering dusk. "You never told me about the camps," I said quietly. He was silent for a long time. Then, "Some things you don't talk about unless you have to. But you talk about Falcon Lake." "That's different," he said. "Falcon Lake. I need to talk about that. Because maybe someone can explain it. Maybe someone knows what it was, the war. I know what that was. I know what humans do. There's no mystery there. Just darkness." He shifted in his chair. I could see the outline of the scars through his shirt. After all these years, they were still there. "Falcon Lake is different," he said again. "That's a question without an answer, and I can't die with that question still sitting in the dark. I have to keep asking." And he did, for 7 more years. May 20th, 2017, 50 years to the day after the encounter. I stood in the White Shell Provincial Park, on the same granite outcrop where my father had knelt half a century before, chipping at a quartz vein, about to have his life turned inside out. Chris Rutkowski was with me. He's Canada's leading UFO researcher, has been studying the Falcon Lake case for decades. Together, we'd written a book about it. When they appeared, Falcon Lake 1967, trying to compile everything, every document, every photograph, every interview, trying to preserve the truth before it faded into myth. The site looked the same as I remembered from the photos. The exposed granite, the surrounding forest, the silence. The circle where the craft had supposedly landed was gone now. 50 years of weather, 50 years of vegetation had erased it, nature reclaiming what had been disturbed. But the government had installed a plaque, a small memorial, acknowledging what had happened here, acknowledging my father's experience. On May 20th, 1967, Stefan Michalak reported a close encounter at this site. The Falcon Lake incident remains one of Canada's most documented UFO cases. CBC was there filming, a documentary for the 50th anniversary. They wanted me to talk about Dad, about what it was, like growing up as the son of the UFO guy. I told them what I always tell people. If Dad hoaxed this, I said, looking into the camera, remember, we're talking about a blue-collar industrial mechanic. If he hoaxed it, then he was a freaking genius. Because that's the thing. To maintain a hoax for 32 years, to never slip up, never change your story, never get caught in a contradiction, to create physical evidence that fooled trained investigators, scientists, doctors, to go to your grave maintaining the same account you gave the day it happened. That takes either truth or genius. And Dad wasn't a genius. He was a mechanic, a rock hound, a guy who liked the quiet of the woods. So I believe him. Not because I can prove what happened. Not because I can explain the craft or the burns or any of it. I believe him because I knew him. I lived with him. I watched him carry this for 32 years. And he never wavered. Standing there on that granite outcrop, I tried to imagine what it must have been like, to be kneeling here alone, chipping at rocks, and suddenly hear the geese panic, to look up and see something impossible descending from the sky, to watch it land, to approach it, to look inside. What did he really see in there? The maze of lights, the panels? What was that? And the blast? That focused column of heat that stamped a grid onto his chest. What was that? I don't know. And that's the hardest part. Not knowing. Never being able to know for certain. But I know something happened. I know my father encountered something on this spot 50 years ago. Something real. Something that left physical marks. Something that changed him. Was it alien? I don't know. Dad never claimed it was. He always said he didn't know what it was. Was it experimental? Some secret military project? Maybe. But if so, why has no government ever acknowledged it? Why has no one ever come forward to explain it? Was it something else entirely? Something we don't have words for? Something that exists in the gaps of our understanding? I don't know. What I do know is this. My father, Stefan Michalak, was a good man. He survived a war. He built a life in a new country. He worked hard. He loved his family. He told the truth as he understood it. On May 20th, 1967, something happened to him that he couldn't explain. And he spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it, trying to share it, trying to warn others. He died in 1999 without ever getting answers. But his story remains. The most documented UFO case in Canadian history. Physical evidence, medical records, government investigations, witness testimony that never changed. Official conclusion, unexplained. And maybe that's where it has to stay. In that space between knowing and not knowing, between proof and doubt, between what we can explain and what we can't. In 2018, the Royal Canadian Mint issued a commemorative coin, $20, silver. It shows the moment of the encounter. My father on the ground, the craft above him, expelling its blast. And the coin glows in the dark, the craft glows, the blast glows. When they sent me a proof copy, I held it in my hand and I cried. Because it meant something. It meant the country was acknowledging what happened to my father. It meant his story was being preserved. It meant he wasn't just the UFO guy anymore. He was part of history. I wish he'd lived to see it. The coin, the plaque, the 50th anniversary, the renewed interest in his case. But he didn't. He died believing most people thought he was crazy. Died without answers. Died with those scars still on his chest. I stood there on the granite, 50 years to the day, and I said a prayer. I'm not particularly religious, but I said one anyway. For Dad, for whatever he encountered here, for the mystery that never got solved. The forest was quiet, the same quiet Dad would have heard. The wind in the pines, the distant call of birds, the ancient rock beneath my feet, remembering everything, revealing nothing. I left an offering, a piece of quartz I'd brought from Dad's old collection. I placed it on the memorial plaque and left it there. For Dad, for his passion, for his truth. The evidence didn't disappear. That's important to understand. For all the skepticism, all the doubts, all the accusations of hoax, the physical evidence remained, the burned shirt with its grid pattern, the melted glove, the cap, the photographs of the burns, the medical records, the RCMP reports, the Royal Canadian Air Force investigations, the lab analyses, all of it, documented, preserved, still sitting in archives waiting to be examined by anyone who cares to look. In 2019, Chris Rutkowski donated his entire collection of UFO research materials to the University of Manitoba archives. 20,000 UFO reports, 10,000 Canadian government documents, thousands of files on cases from across Canada, and the crown jewel of the collection, the Falcon Lake files, everything about Dad's case, every document, every photograph, every interview, all preserved for researchers, historians, scientists, anyone who wants to examine the evidence. At the donation ceremony, they displayed Dad's burned shirt for the first time in decades. Under glass, protected, but visible. I stood there looking at it, this piece of fabric my father had been wearing on May 20th, 1967. The grid pattern was still clearly visible, burned through the material in precise circles, matching exactly the pattern that had been on his chest. A woman next to me, a researcher, whispered, "How does someone fake that?" And that's the question, isn't it? How do you fake that grid pattern? How do you create burns on fabric that match burns on skin? How do you fool medical doctors, RCMP investigators, Air Force personnel, lab technicians? More importantly, why would you? What would be the point? Dad never made money from his story. He published that pamphlet in 1967, but it was self-published, barely circulated. He didn't write books. He didn't go on lecture circuits. He didn't sell his story to Hollywood. All he got was ridicule, skepticism, and a lifetime of being the UFO guy. If it was a hoax, it was the most pointless hoax in history. But I don't think it was a hoax. I think something happened. Something real. Something that left evidence. And that evidence is still here. Scientists have examined it over the years. the soil samples, the metal fragments that were recovered from the site, the radioactive readings, nothing conclusive. That's always the frustrating part. The evidence is consistent with Dad's account, but it doesn't prove extraterrestrial origin. It doesn't prove experimental aircraft. It doesn't prove anything beyond. Something unusual happened here. The radiation found at the site, low level, could be natural. The Precambrian shield contains radioactive minerals, but the readings were elevated in specific spots, in the cracks of the rock. Why there specifically? The metal fragments, analyzed and found to be mostly silver, 95% pure, with trace radioactivity, but silver occurs naturally in the region, and the radioactivity was low level, comparable to radium-based paint from the era. So, natural phenomenon or something else? The burns remain the most compelling evidence, that grid pattern. Doctors who examined Dad in 1967 couldn't explain them. They weren't consistent with any known type of burn, too precise, too organized. One doctor said it looked like something had stamped them onto his skin, like a mechanical process, not fire, not chemical, something else. And they matched the holes in the shirt. Exactly. Same pattern, same spacing, same size. If it was a hoax, Dad would have had to create a template with precisely spaced holes, use that template to burn his shirt in a convincing way, use the same template to inflict first-degree burns on his own chest in exactly the same pattern, make himself violently ill for weeks, maintain perfect consistency in his story through hundreds of interviews over 3 decades, fool military investigators, police, doctors and scientists, all for what? To be mocked? To be called crazy? To have his family's life turned upside down? It doesn't make sense. So I'm left with what I've always known. Something happened to my father. Something real. Something that left evidence, and the evidence is still here, waiting. Waiting for technology to improve, waiting for understanding to deepen, waiting for someone to finally explain what happened on that granite outcrop. In May 1967, maybe someday we'll know. Maybe someday someone will crack the mystery. Until then, the evidence remains. I was there. Not in the woods, not when it happened. But I was there for everything that came after. I was there when Dad came home that night, sick and burned and smelling like something wrong. I was there in the hallway, 9 years old, smelling sulphur and terror. I was there through the investigations, through the media circus, through the years of being the UFO kid. I was there watching Dad get sicker, watching him lose weight, watching him carry something nobody could explain. I was there for the Mayo Clinic, for the accusations, for the skepticism, for all of it. I was there when he told the story, hundreds of times, always the same, never changing, never embellishing, and I was there when he died, November 1999, 83 years old, still carrying those scars, still without answers. But here's what I know. My father wasn't a liar. He wasn't a hoaxer. He wasn't crazy. He was a man who experienced something extraordinary, something that changed him, something that marked him physically and followed him for the rest of his life. Whether it was alien, I don't know. He never claimed it was. Whether it was experimental, I don't know. If it was, no government has ever acknowledged it. Whether it was something else, something we don't have categories for, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we don't. Maybe, but something happened. That much I'm certain of. Because I saw the aftermath, I saw the burns, I smelled that smell, I watched my father's body fight something for years. I watched him tell the same story with the same details for 3 decades. And I watched him die without ever getting answers. That's the hardest part. Not the skepticism, not the ridicule, the fact that he never knew, never got to understand what happened to him. He spent 32 years carrying that question. What was it? What did I encounter? What burned me? Why me? And he died without answers. But his story remains. The most documented UFO case in Canadian history. The evidence is still here. The photographs, the medical records, the government investigations, the burned shirt with its impossible pattern, all of it, still here, waiting. The official conclusion remains, unexplained, and maybe that's where it has to stay, in that liminal space between proof and mystery, between what we can document and what we can understand. But I want you to know this. If you ever find yourself in the Whiteshell Provincial Park, about 90 miles east of Winnipeg, and you hike into the woods north of the Trans-Canada Highway, you'll find a granite outcrop. Pink Precambrian shield rock, exposed and ancient. There's a small memorial plaque there now. Stand on that rock. Feel the stone beneath your feet, billions of years old. Listen to the wind in the pines. Watch the way the light falls through the trees, and know that on May 20th, 1967, something happened here. Something that changed my father's life. Something that marked him forever. Something real. I don't know what it was. My father didn't know what it was. Nobody knows what it was. But it was real. And I was there, not when it happened, but for everything that came after. I was there. On a clear night, if you stand on that granite outcrop and look up at the stars, you can see thousands of them. Millions. Galaxies beyond counting, distances so vast they make our entire lives seem like a single breath. And somewhere in all that vastness, maybe there's an answer. Maybe someone knows what my father encountered. Maybe it's written in some file somewhere, gathering dust. Maybe it's classified. Maybe it's forgotten. Or maybe it's still out there, still moving through the cosmos, still unexplained. My father died in 1999, 83 years old. He's buried in Winnipeg. His gravestone doesn't mention Falcon Lake. It just says his name, his dates, and beloved husband, father, and grandfather. But he's also memorialized at Falcon Lake, on that plaque, on that commemorative coin, in the archives, in the evidence that remains, and now, in this story. I've told you everything I know, everything I saw, everything I lived through as the son of Stefan Michalak. I've told you about the call from Winnipeg in 1999, about the rocknut who loved the quiet of the wilderness, about Victoria Day weekend 1967, about the geese, about the craft, about the grid, about the burn. I've told you about the smell. God, that smell. About the hospitals, about the investigators, about the circus, about the sickness that never quite left, about living with it, about unsolved mysteries, about the evidence that remains. I've told you about a man who saw something he couldn't explain and spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it, trying to share it, trying to warn others, a man who never changed his story, never wavered, never gave up on the truth as he understood it. That was my father, Stefan Michalak, born in Poland 1916, died in Winnipeg 1999, survived a war, built a life, loved rocks and the quiet of the woods, and on May 20th, 1967, encountered something extraordinary. I don't know what it was, but I know it was real, because I was there. For everything that came after, I was there.